Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Today's Wednesday. I got a very special guest, Seth Frantzman. He's previously been a guest on the show. But Seth is in Israel covering the war. Seth is an adjunct fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, as well as the acting news editor and senior Middle East correspondent and analyst for the Jerusalem Post, as well as a contributor to the Long War Journal. Seth's written 2 books, one, Drone Wars, Pioneers, Killing Machines, Artificial Intelligence, and the Battle for the Future. I read that one, highly recommend it, as well as After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. Seth, welcome back to Generation Jihad. You already are welcome at Long War Journal since you're right there almost daily. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure, Seth. So much to cover. We'll try and pick the 3, 4, 5 top issues. I think I want to start today because this seems to be the biggest story coming out of Israel and the region, which is the ceasefire talks. There's a lot of pressure, particularly by the Biden administration, which is facing internal political pressure within the Democratic Party to get a ceasefire, really to get the fighting to stop. Seth, what is the mood in Israel, and what do you think the likelihood is that the coalition government led by Benjamin Netanyahu? People forget that he's not the only person making decisions. He has a wartime government in place, so it's not just him that would make this decision. So what do you think? What are the odds that the Netanyahu government is going to accept the terms of a ceasefire has been put out there? And really briefly, in exchange for, I believe they said something like, what I'd last read was a hostage for every day of the ceasefire, the Israeli hostage. And basically, we're going to get one of these 10-to-1 situations where one Israeli hostage is released in turn for in exchange for 10 or so, might be 5, might be 10 prisoners. These are Palestinians who've been convicted of terrorism charges. What do you think the prospects of this type of peace deal, or not peace deal, but the ceasefire being approved?
Well, I mean, it's 50-50. I think there's a lot of pressure, as you said. I mean, there's the Ramadan Muslim holiday coming up next month, so I guess in about 2 weeks. Obviously, the Biden administration says they want it. Hamas is being hosted by Qatar or Doha. Doha is a major NATO U.S. ally, so there's some pressure there. In Israel, there's internal, domestic pressure by, first of all, the families of the hostages. There's about 134 hostages, of which the government, I think, or the IDF has said some 20 or so are believed to have been killed, and so that would leave 105 or 110 or so living. Among those, the most sensitive ones, obviously, are the injured people, older people. Most of those are men that were not released in the first round. And then there's the women, which include 5 women soldiers, I think. So those are mostly very young women. Of course, the reports have been, some of them have been assaulted or abused or what have you. So, the families are urgently demanding they need to release these people, because the families are saying, because every day that goes by, every few days, there's been, they said, well, someone's been killed. So I think that's where we're heading. It's not clear. It's really touch and go, because, Hamas has to deliver the goods. And as you mentioned, the whole nature of the deal, having one hostage a day released for around 4 prisoners or so, or 10 or whatever, it's not ideal in terms of the optics, because it allows Hamas to really squeeze it and allow them to slow play it every day and use it for influence operations. And we've seen them do this before, where it's really degrading and humiliating. So I think the government will have to wonder whether they really want to spend a month watching Hamas celebrate this.
Yeah, I remember some of those videos coming out. I mean, it was just really horrific. Horrific is the wrong word, but very insulting. If I was an Israeli watching, young women and grandmothers and, mothers being released in the fashion that they were, being forced to, being sort of pressured to smile and shake hands and say goodbye to their captors. I got to tell you, if the Israelis, if there is an agreement, and I just would say this to the Israeli government and Israeli people, beware of Qataris bearing ceasefires and peace deals and How do we know? Just ask the Afghan people. Look at what that so-called peace deal led to. The Qataris cannot be trusted. The If there is some type of agreement on a prisoner exchange and a ceasefire, the I'm sorry, hostage and slash prisoner exchange and a ceasefire, um, the Israelis cannot countenance the Hamas putting on these displays of the releases. This is just absolutely absurd. And you nailed it too. Hamas and company, they really excel at stringing this out. And you know, is it really in the Israelis' interest to release one hostage a day? You know, in that, just the visuals, absolutely correct. So we're approaching the fifth month of war since the horrific attacks on October 7th in southern Israel. What is the general mood within the Israeli people? I know that's a really difficult question to ask, but are we seeing the same resolve we saw months, the opening days or several months ago? And in addition, is the view of the average Israeli changed towards the United States? Is the United States viewed as being a major supporter, or as its dabblings with Hamas and Qatar um, caused an erosion of an opinion?
Right. Well, as you said, it's difficult to judge the whole, the huge number of people and the big political spectrum you have here. But I would say that, after October, 7th, let's say the first few days or weeks was a lot of shock and a lot of, there was a lot of sense of what, how has this happened? Has the army how do they abandon the border? Why intelligence was so bad? And if the intelligence doesn't know about Hamas, what's packing up in Hezbollah, or what other worse things are going to happen? I think but when the Hezbollah war didn't start and people started to get things together, I think there was, 350,000 people called up to reserve duty. So then there was a sense of national mission. There was a sense of, I don't know if you're probably familiar with, people listeners are familiar with the term from the First World War, lions led by donkeys, which portrays the average, doughboy and grunts going to war. Those people are great. I'm not entirely sure about who's in charge of them, but we like the soldiers. And I think Israel, regardless, some people on the political spectrum certainly are very pro, Netanyahu. So certainly the army as an institution is one that is the last institution in Israel that is still considered very highly trusted. So therefore, I think there was a sense that, regardless of how bad things are, everyone is unified in terms of the war against Hamas. And there is that national unity. Now, as you said, 5 months into it, there is still a national unity. I think even though there are certainly protests, for the hostages, and some of the people on the right view those people protesting as the left, in the sense of the people that were protesting prior against Netanyahu's government for judicial reforms. They say, well, that's just been picked up now, and those people have kind of glommed on the protest, the hostage families. So there are definitely divisions that are emerging. I think now they say that the defense minister has just given a speech just now where he's called for the ultra orthodox in Israel to be drafted to the army. The Orthodox are not drafted, and you see a war with huge numbers of casualties, at least in terms of Israel's last 20 years of warfare, and you have whole segments of society who just don't go. So that's certainly a controversial issue. But I would say that there's one thing that just happened yesterday, which was municipal elections. The municipalities in Israel all voted in the municipal elections in Israel. I think turnout was like a record low, or was very low. And I would say low turnout tells you bad things about a society. It says that a lot of people are complacent, apathetic, or they don't believe in the system. And I think, one could wonder then, is that a quiet protest vote of lots of people saying, you know what, I don't entirely believe in this system after October 7th. And I think there you have to say to yourself, the high turnout in the municipal elections, what was the highest demographic? The ultra-Orthodox, which is, again, a sector that's not in the army and is sometimes seen as not part of the mainstream in terms of the national unity issues. So, what might be is happening in Israeli society is a lot of quiet, where they say still waters run deep, or what have you. A lot of things that are bubbling deep down. The surface, everything is kind of quiet, kind of, keep calm, carry on, don't panic. We'll see what happens. We're winning. There's a sense, I think, people want to believe that the operation has been successful, but they want the hostages back. They want the government promised them there will not be Hamas when this is over. And I think a lot of people are wondering, well, it's still there. So eventually there's a denouement that comes where it's like, wait, this didn't happen. But is it at 6 months of war or a year? When do they get to that?
Yeah, Has the government been clear about the length of time that they believe that this operation to eliminate Hamas would take? Or has that been nebulous?
I think in the beginning, everyone said it will take a long time. And then
That's what
they
I
go, well, what do you
recall,
mean?
Seth.
What do you mean a long time? And then people would say, then people would say, well, month. And then some people said years. And people would raise their eyebrows and say, well, years? I mean, really years? I mean, because that means up until the next elections in Israel. I mean, because people have been saying, listen, once the war winds down, we need to have elections. And so this is unacceptable what's happened. There's another side to this. The government also said they're not going to investigate the failures of October 7th until the war is over. Well, if it goes on for years, you ask yourself, well, wait a sec, I don't get it. I mean, doesn't the evidence kind of disappear after years? If you want to interview let's say, a battalion commander about what happened on October 7th, if that commander now spent 2 years fighting, what is he going to remember? I mean,
He could possibly die during fighting.
Yeah, right. I mean, there was just a platoon or another commander from one of the key Givati units that died recently. I mean, yeah, so you're losing all these people. It doesn't make sense. It's totally not logical. So, like, I think the real story was 6 months or up to a year. So not years, but not just quote several months. Like, I think the sense was 6 months to a year. The question is, as Gallant, the defense minister, always said, this is in phases. So phase one was a bombing campaign. Phase two was a heavy, massive, intense campaign of thousands of strike missions. And then phase three was sort of a bit of a pause and then winding down, then low intensity, then probably counterinsurgency. So, you could call it like the surge or something in Iraq, some sort of kind of graph it like that or something.
And really quickly, has opinion of the United States, is there more wariness given the Biden administration's genuflecting to Hamas and Qatar?
It's very hard to measure that. I haven't seen studies on it or surveys. I can only provide one, anecdotal evidence, which I was sitting with someone yesterday who was certainly a very mainstream Israeli who works as a poll monitor and totally normal mainstream person. And we were talking about the United States and Israel and pressure and whether they can be relied on and stuff. And he said, well, I don't trust the United States, So I think that there's a lot of people that are, it's not about, I don't think it's about Biden. It's about the whole last 15, 20 years of different administrations taking totally different tactics. Like, let's do the Iran deal. Oh, wait, how about we'll recognize the Golan Heights as part of Israel? Oh, wait, let's say the Golan Heights are not part of Israel. Wait, settlements are good. Settlements are bad. I mean, I think people have just got to the point. I mean, there's some people on the political spectrum who anyway were, let's say, very skeptical of the U.S. and some people that are super, super, pro-Europe and pro-U.S. and say, listen, Israel cannot ever, criticize its Western allies because Israel is just a Western country. And that's just where Israel is. It just cannot afford that. So, but I think there is a general sense probably among the average public that, the U.S. is a great, wonderful ally and a wonderful country, but it's not entirely always clear what its interests are. And certainly its interests don't always align. When it says ceasefire, well, Israel's going to keep fighting until Israel gets its goals met. And the fact that the U.S. closest ally in the region, Doha and Qatar, is hosting Hamas is, I think, probably lots of sensible people think that's heavily problematic.
And has there been any observations about the polling that's occurred where a lot of the significant percentages, like 20 to 30% of American, I believe they were in the 18 to 25 range, where, we're saying the Holocaust is is a myth, and Israelis or Jews are oppressor class, things like that. Is that a concern, or is that not even being noticed in Israel?
I don't know if people have time to notice it and drill down into that. I think there's certainly a sense that the far left and extremists in the West, or maybe some and also sometimes on the far right, are just, that's where you find anti-Semitism, and that's where you find Holocaust denial and things, and that's kind of always been there. And if it got worse, it got worse. But Israel can't change. I mean, Israel can't abolish itself to make those people happy. So that, I think there's a general sense of like, those people just, you have to discount them. And if they say, well, there's more of them, well, okay. I mean, I think Israelis just figure they can't do anything about that, and they can't change. They can't change their whole country, or basically what those people want is for them to disappear. Well, most people won't accept that. So,
yeah, if those numbers were in the single digits, my concern would be pretty low. But those numbers they're creeping up there, and given the state of American education and what's being taught and not taught, I just expect it to get worse. That's one of the things that really long term is my concern for the support of Israel. Isn't in particular administration or feckless policy. Those things happen, and yeah, you're absolutely correct. U.S. policy vis-a-vis Israel has been, and the Middle East, right? We got a JPCOA with Iran. Oh, we revoke it. We move the capital to Jerusalem. Then we tell all this. It must be maddening, but what really concerns me is that erosion of support. 20 to 30%. We're not in the margins anymore. We're talking about a significant portion of the U.S. population, and I have to wonder what percentage of them are in the foreign policy field, right? In the field that's going to influence places like the State Department. We already have seen a lot of problems, but we won't. We'll move on to more tactical issues now. I'm just curious if that's something that's even been noticed in Israel. And like you said, I suspect you're right. There's got too many fish to fry. What are we doing with Hamas? What are we doing with Hezbollah? But let's turn to Hezbollah. You'd mentioned that there's been some significant attacks on both sides of the border, the Lebanese-Israeli border. You noted yesterday that Hezbollah is escalating its attacks lately. Talk about this. What does this mean? Do we believe that this simmering low-level war along the border, which, by the way, one single attack would have been responded violently, just prior on October 6th and before, and now this has become commonplace. It's become, as Joe Truzman says, the new normal. Is just a series of daily attacks along the Israel-Lebanese border.
Yes, right. So it is unprecedented, and the ability of Hezbollah to kind of get away with this and have this impunity, was because Hezbollah kind of exploited the Hamas attack to then jump in and support Hamas on October 8th, prodded by the Iranians probably to open the second front. And Hezbollah has decided to do these kind of smaller attacks along the border and not, they understand there's a red line somewhere, but I think there is a strange kind of dance that's taking place, a kind of proportion dance. And what that means is Hezbollah has been attacking along the border with missiles, rockets, anti-tank missiles, drones, and it's a large number of attacks up until January. It was around, several thousand, 2,000 rockets and hundreds of anti-tank missiles. They damaged 500 homes almost, more buildings, and they killed a bit more than a dozen people, including several soldiers. Now, after that, from January to February or so, they've continued. And Israel has continued to strike back. So Israel has struck more than 1,000 targets in Lebanon. So you do the math. You can understand that we're talking really what is a kind of tit for tat. But Israel pays a huge price because 80,000 people had to be evacuated from these communities. Again, totally unprecedented in Israel's history. No country evacuates every person on the border within 10 miles of the border or something. I mean, imagine in America doing that. You're talking about evacuating millions of people or something because of some rocket fire from cartels or something. I mean, no one would accept that, obviously. So what Israel has done is totally unacceptable, I think, from most countries' points of view. But Israel felt it has to do that because it has to concentrate on Gaza and doesn't. And the northern residents were saying, you can't abandon us like the people next to Gaza were. So that's what happened. In the last several days, this escalation has grown. And I think it grew partly because everyone thinks there's going to be a ceasefire down there in Gaza. And so what Hezbollah and maybe Israel also is thinking, well, let's get in a few licks before the ceasefire. As we all know, that can become a huge explosion. And I'll just give you a quick details of what happened then. So on Sunday, the 25th, Israel's defense minister, Gallant, went to the north, to Northern Command. He said, even if there's a ceasefire, we will continue to increase the attacks on Hezbollah. Now, that's important because in the last pause in fighting in November, Hezbollah had basically stopped attacking because Hezbollah kind of got dragged into this war a bit and didn't really wanted to recuperate a bit. They've lost, now hundreds of their terrorists. So when Gallant said that, the next day there was escalation. The Hezbollah fired surface-to-air missiles at an Israeli drone. Well, they've done that before, but they downed the drone. And Israel also used a David Sling medium-range interceptor to go after one of these missiles. So that in itself was a big escalation, even though, as some people said, yeah, but they fired the missiles before. Right, but the missile didn't always connect. When it connects, then it's a big deal. So in retaliation for that, Israel carried out a bunch of strikes deep in northern Lebanon, I think about 100 kilometers from the border, in a place called Baalbek. And that obviously was a target bank that Israel was waiting probably for an excuse to strike. And Israel said, okay, now we've got an excuse to do it. And the next day, then Hezbollah fired missiles at a sensitive site on Mount Meron in the north, which is called an air traffic control site. It's an IDF facility. And the IDF admitted that this facility was attacked and admitted that I think one rocket hit it. So Hezbollah has done that before, but it's a big message to Israel, which is basically the message is Hezbollah is saying, we know where your sensitive sites are. If you mess around, we'll fire hundreds of rockets at it until we get through your air defenses, because air defenses have a 90% success rate or something. If you fire enough, you'll get through. So it's a very dangerous tit for tat. There seems to be a proportional element to it, but the proportion is growing. People are not dying generally, although a few Hezbollah commanders have met their end at the end of a missile. But I think the big question mark is, where does it go if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, and if Hezbollah feels that Israel keeps attacking and says, "Wait, you've changed the rules of the game. We're going to change the rules too." So that's where we are, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about the rules of the game. It's almost the rules used to be. Hezbollah launches an attack, the Israelis respond overwhelmingly. Now it's, as you noted, tit for tat. And that's become the new normal. I think that's a really dangerous thing for the Israelis, because then there'll be pressure on the Israelis to respond proportionately and, to go into that tit for tat mode. And I don't think that's something that Israel, they can't play that game. And, another thing you noted, I mean, that border has been evacuated for what? It's coming up on 5 months now. That's a significant strain on there has to be some significant war weariness coming from that aspect, and of the population. And the longer that the Israelis delay this operation in the north, which I think is important, and I think the bigger problems they're going to have both locally and particularly from the international community, because once the rules are redefined for Israel, it's always redefined in a way that Israel comes out on the losing end. But let's move on to Gaza. The Israeli military is waiting to launch its offensive in Rafah. That is the large city along the border with Egypt. I talked to Joe Truzman in our last podcast about this, and I'm really curious about your opinion on this theory. I think the Israelis made a significant mistake. I think it made a strategic error here in their operation in Gaza. I would have launched my attack in Rafah first. I would have closed off that border with Egypt, because the eastern and northern border of Gaza, that borders with Israel. Israel can control that border. The western border is along the Mediterranean Sea. The Israeli Navy can control that border. But the border with Egypt is one where we know there's tunnels running back and forth. So I would have ensured that that exit point to Egypt was shut down immediately. And I would have done it. That would have been my opening stage, and then work to segment Gaza and partition it, right, and go and do your operations. But the Israelis, they did this backwards. And what do you think? Did they make a mistake here? And if so, what do you think the reasoning for the Israelis to approach it from north to south rather than south to north?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree. I think that if you want a decisive knockout win against an enemy like Hamas, which has thrived on controlling access to Gaza for 15 years and basically stealing or having a weird mafia-like partnership with the aid that goes in which Hamas steals a bit of it and then uses it for things like tunnels. So I think, yeah, in order to cut off, the kind of where the mafia gets all its money from is you go in and you should cut it off at where it starts. So it would have made sense to go in heavy along the border, but obviously there was a sensitivity with Egypt. And I assume there was another sensitivity of, if you cut off the border, then Israel becomes responsible for all these 2 million people. And Israel becomes then the one that has to deliver all the food and stuff, which apparently Israel didn't want to get in the business of being, nation building humanitarian aid person. It just wanted to wage a military only campaign, military only, no civilians. And in order to do that, what they decided to do was, as you said, the opposite way. Let's move the civilians bit by bit by bit south by dropping leaflets and making millions of calls. And then you move them out of a neighborhood bit by bit, and then you go in with the armor and APCs and all the technology that Israel has, a lot of AI and all this tech, and that way you can reduce the number of casualties apparently, because driving into Rafah in the beginning of the war would put the army sitting basically across a border and sitting across 500,000 civilians, which they didn't apparently want to do. So they chose that other way of this very, very clean type of war in their view, which is anyone that's on the battlefield still is a combatant because everyone had been told to evacuate. And that they thought that would work better. again, it also apparently they thought would give them leverage to turn up the pressure slowly by first cutting off Gaza City and kind of doing this, and then slowly going into southern Gaza bit by bit, so that you can always turn the pressure by saying, well, if you don't release more hostages, okay, we go into this neighborhood. The problem is that there was a self-fulfilling prophecy with that, which is that on November 24th, they got the first hostage deal. And everyone said, you see, the pressure campaign is working. But then there was no more deals for a whole plethora of reasons. But the problem is that they openly said, okay, now we're going to do this pressure campaign. Well, Hamas can read it also. And they said, okay, we'll just move all of the hostages to Rafah, and we'll move 80% of our fighters that are left to Rafah, whatever. I mean, they only have 6 or 7 battalions left, but they all moved. They all ran away down there like rats fleeing a sinking ship or whatever. But they're all sitting there now, and they're basically calling Israel's bluff, because they're saying, hey, we've now brought all the 1.5 million Palestinians here to Rafah. You can't come into Rafah because your way of fighting war is that you want no civilians there. Well, we've got the civilian shields now, and we're not going to let them leave. And we're holding on to the spigot of international aid. So we can, by the way, if you're Hamas, can create a humanitarian crisis by just not letting the aid trucks come in. Then people start starving. Then you have to stop the war. And that's exactly the game they're playing. And that's why, as we started this whole conversation, it still looks like they're almost dictating the terms of these hostage deals. And it's a very, very dangerous thing after 5 months of war, in which supposedly, tactically, Israel's winning, but strategically, big question mark.
I concur. It's the strategic. It's the time. It's an excellent point. And, look, if Israel wants to go into Rafah and fight a civilian, without civilians in the area, they're going to have to allow those civilians to filter up north. And then the Israelis would still be responsible for providing aid and whatnot. So they put themselves in the same situation, except it's 5 months after the attack. International support has decreased, and political pressure on Israel has increased, external political pressure. This is why I would have taken Rafah and shut that border down, would have dug a moat 400 feet deep and said, go ahead and tunnel through water if you can. And started from there. I really think this was a big mistake. I think that the Israelis thinking that they can fight this war, on their own terms and be immune from, political criticism externally is they just have to fight the war they got to fight. And I just don't like the Israelis just haven't learned this lesson after decades and decades of dealing with the Palestinians. So any thoughts on that before we move on to our last topic?
Well, we have to remember the question of learning curve is very important here. The entire, general staff of Israel, everyone from a brigade commander up, maybe even lower than that, battalion up. But anyway, their experience fighting wars, unfortunately, is the 1990s and 2000. And as someone who's an expert as you are, in long wars and counterterrorism and what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's a bit of an issue when the experience of large numbers of commanders in Israel has been never really winning a war, but fighting lots of small wars in Gaza, in which you pat yourself on the back afterward and you say, well, we sort of won because we took out 567 targets and we destroyed a lot of stuff. So and we only lost 1 soldier, so that's a win, right? And it's like, okay, but what is the goal? What is the win? Like, what is the decisive win? Where do you define victory? And if you're never had a victory, but you have lots of wins, I think, and then someone tells you, wait, it's like now you have to fight a war with 300,000 soldiers and 9 divisions under your command. It's like the American army that was sent into the first months of the Civil War, right? Those guys had been fighting literally Indian wars or something, right? Since the Mexican War. They had no experience of fighting the massive battles they were about to be thrown into of 500,000 men or 250,000 men on a field of battle. And we know what happened. Huge numbers of people got massacred because of it. It took them 4 years to find General Grant to finally win the thing. So history tells us exactly what happened. That's just my point. It's important to look at who the people running the war are, for better or for good. Their experience plays a lot into this.
Yeah, absolutely. You described Iraq, you described Afghanistan post-invasion, right? We won all these series of running battles, well, mostly against the Taliban, and then lost the war because we didn't really understand how to fight wars. I one of the things, I don't want to get too, off topic here, but it's you could fight these smaller wars and extend them out, but I think it has a more debilitating effect on society and on your ability to come to a conclusion. If these wars drag on, if they're indecisive, you destroy societies. You create animosity, and you never achieve victory. So you lose domestic political support, and then eventually, the international community turns on you. This is where I say the Israelis needed to, go in, go hard, and fight this war on their terms and get it over with. If they would have launched a crushing attack on Hamas and the war was over in 3 months and Hamas was defeated, no, is that possible? I can't sit here and tell you. I would have, again, there's a lot of things I would have done differently, but that's neither here nor there. That would have been more advantageous for both the Israelis and for the Palestinians who are in Gaza, because this war isn't continuing. But the longer it's drug out, the more I think it's immoral to fight wars the way we have been, the U.S., the way Israel has been fighting these wars. They're well intentioned, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The intentions are limit civilian casualties and et cetera, et cetera. Except as you extend wars, you can increase civilian casualties because of the length of war and the nature of the fighting. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox on that one and ask you, unless you have any thoughts on that, Seth, but I wanted to quickly, discuss the Israeli Navy's role in this as well.
Oh, well, just briefly, I mean, I think it's entirely correct. I mean, what the statistics or data tells us from the Hamas Foreign Health Ministry, but I think Israel has sort of confirmed to some extent some of it. 30,000 people have been killed in Gaza. And even if it's true that 10,000 of them are combatants, that's still 20,000 civilians. And people can run the numbers however they want and say, yes, but in Mosul, it was one combatant for every two civilians, et cetera, et cetera. But the toll has been immense in Gaza. The destruction is immense. And the toll in Israel is unprecedented. Israel's fought the most intense, difficult, awful war of its entire history, with more people evacuated, more civilian casualties than ever in its history. So, yeah, I mean, what about a decisive campaign on October 8th rather than the campaign that was launched? Maybe there would have been a lot dead in a short period of time, but in a long period of time, perhaps less. I don't know, but it's always easy to do Monday morning quarterbacking, whatever. But I think that you have a good point. Long, slow, depressing wars and a trickle of dead is probably much more traumatic sometimes than a very quick, awful war that is less traumatic. And let's talk about the Navy.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Tell us.
Talk about it?
You wrote a great article about this. Tell us about your experiences with going out with the Israeli Navy.
So the Israeli Navy is historically very small in terms of Israel's not a naval power. It doesn't have it's not the United Kingdom or what have you, but it's always had a Navy. It still has a Navy. It has several submarines. It has a new 4 corvettes ships, the Star 6 class, which are super high tech, which are supposed to defend the territorial or extraterritorial waters off the coast. And then it has these Devora class patrol boats, squadrons of them that are basically for patrolling very close to the coastline. So I had a chance to go out with one of these units, the 916 squadron, which is based in Ashdod in southern Israel, and that's a patrol boat that is 100 or 200 feet long, and it has a main gun and a gun on the back, and then several machine guns on the side. And we went out at night and did some target practice, but the boats have been very important in terms of Israel's ability to basically use them to do close combat along the shore. And so on October 7th and 8th, they were used to help, eliminate and neutralize terrorists that were basically flooding into Israel. And then, as they told it, they saw the terrorists coming back to Gaza with bodies of hostages, dead bodies, I guess, and they're trying to kidnap, corpses, and they eliminated them. So they played a big role. And then after that, they brought down some guys from the Armored Corps and talked to them and learned about so that they could be prepared for when the Armored Corps went into Gaza. And then they basically sat off the shoreline and helped the guys on the beach as the guys were going south. The Navy would move along with them, the battalion with the squadron, and they would help them take out targets that they could see from the water. So the Navy has played a very important role in this war, bigger than any war in the past, I think, in terms of using ships to do like I guess you call it littoral combat or whatever, coastal, close support from the naval gunners. It's a very unique and important role for the Israeli Navy. And I think it's not actually a role they really had prepared that much for. So luckily they had a bit of time to coordinate. And I think everyone's been pretty happy with the ability of the Navy to play such an important role, one that it hadn't necessarily envisioned for itself. And and apparently conduct, carry out a lot of important strike missions along the coastline and neutralize these naval. Hamas has its own like frogmen and commandos or whatever. So basically, to get rid of most of that threat.
Yeah, it's interesting. I imagine the traditional role of the Israeli Navy would have been sort of smuggling interdiction and coastal defense, right? So it's interesting to see how units evolve over time. You as you were talking about your embed with the Israeli Navy, when I was in Iraq in it was 2005, I was at the Haditha Dam, and Lake Haditha is actually quite large and quite beautiful. And the Marines had a small patrol boat unit out there, and they needed to test out the miniguns on there, so they took me for a ride. And so yeah, you gave me a little flashback there, Seth, and I appreciate that. But I do recall when I was in Israel the first time I went there in 2007, stayed at a hotel in Tel Aviv, and the had a view to the ocean. And I remember seeing those patrol boats going back and forth up the coast several times a day. You see them at dusk, you'd see them at dawn, and so it's interesting to know that they've evolved their tactics and they're supportive of the fight against Hamas. Anything else before we depart today, Seth?
No, it's all good.
Well, look, thanks for joining us today. It's a real pleasure talking with you, and we'll get you back on the program real soon.
Great, thank you.
Seth, you take care. Be safe out there when you're covering this war. And thanks again for everyone listening to today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can listen to us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe to Generation Jihad and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again real soon.